Yes, good evening.
Hi, Pastor. Hi,
Good to see
Anthea.
Hello.
you.
Hello, good
Hello,
evening.
hello. We're really pleased to have you both with us. We
Delighted.
looked at your bios, and Anthea, I didn't realize your dissertation was actually on race and the administration of the Adventist Church. So we're going to really
Yeah.
get into that a little
Feels,
bit.
feels perfect.
And and Pastor Sam, the previous president of a very predominantly black conference. It would be really interesting to look into your experience and your journey in
Sure.
some respects as well. So I think we'll start with Anthea and we'll begin to look at what were some of the key elements that you found. No, before we get to that, what sparked your interest in studying grace and our Adventist Church?
Well, I was doing, my whole master's was on Commonwealth and Imperial History. And I'd always been interested in colonialism, in Black history. And I actually had wanted to
Mm,
do a master's in Black British history. And there was no such course in England running. So believe it or not.
wow.
And so I had gone into colonialism. I'd gone to King's College London and decided to do this course, which was quite interesting. Although you have to read against the grain, because most of the sources are written by the colonialists, and everybody else is silent. Um,
Mm,
and when it came to writing a dissertation, my lecturer had lots of different interesting ideas as to things I was doing, and a good friend and mentor of mine, Dr. David Trim, when he heard about some of the things that they were throwing at me, he was like, "This doesn't sound like you. It doesn't sound like you. These aren't your interests." And so he was trying to tease out of me things that I might be interested in. And so we started talking about the church. And to be fair, I had no idea what I was going to discover when looking at race and politics in the church. The time I looked at historically was, before my birth. And so it was very surprising the things that I discovered. So that's a bit of the history as why I went into what I did.
Before we move on, we've got a couple of questions asking where can they read your dissertation.
And it's a question that I get asked a lot. Well, actually, it is in the New Bold Library, which I hear is shut until January, so that's not very helpful to anybody. But I am at the moment revising it and hoping to publish it in the next few months. I think that there are a lot of lessons, as a young person growing up in the church, I think it's given me the insight to be able to see history repeating itself in
Okay.
many different ways. The church has changed phenomenally, and so I think watch this space. The next few months, I will be releasing it.
When you release it
And
now.
I will do. I will do. That's something that I'm planning to do in the next few months. So yes.
So release it before the library opens again. So
Well, I must say, my little pitch would be that because of the word count, I mean, I could have, with the amount of material that I got from the archival holdings, um, I could have pretty much done a PhD on the subject, just
okay.
with the amount of just the word count. I'm not talking about. I don't want anybody else to be offended who's got a PhD. I'm just talking about the
Yeah.
amount of information I had and the scope that I had to stick
Mm,
to. So what I have done is I'm going back through all my research and adding very interesting stories which weren't relevant to the actual dissertation, but I think would be really, really interesting, such as the conference denying they wouldn't marry a black and white couple because they said they were unequally yoked and so they couldn't get married in an Adventist church. Isn't that an interesting story?
would you
So
say it?
wait for the book. Wait for the book, Abby. So,
Okay, okay. All right.
so those kind of things I'm going to go back over and add to it. And I'm
Mm,
also adding another chapter which brings us up to date. So this is where we were, but
Mm.
giving
mm.
historical perspective and looking at the church now, and how the dynamics have changed. So it's historical, but there is going to be a fair amount of social commentary within the historical context as well.
Okay, let's dig into that history.
Yes.
Troy.
Yeah.
I know Troy has some questions, so let's get digging. Let's get digging.
So with with digging into the history, I'm curious. What was the? Did you notice any, say, overarching themes and trends across our history, particularly in key moments? For instance, with civil rights movements, or around the time when the Windrush generation would come to England. Did you notice any trends? And also attached,
Yes.
after you answer, maybe Pastor Sam, if you could speak to see how your experience in church, see if it matched up with those findings. So it's a 2-in-1 question, or possibly 3-in-1 question.
I would say that the church, one thing, the trend that I found is that the church, by and large, mirrors the wider society. So whatever's going on in wider society, you find mirrored very closely within the church community. So, you have the influx of I can't, Dr. Ramey has already said we can't use the word immigration. So we have the citizens arriving to England in 1948 and coming into the church. And what you find is that the Adventist church in that regard is a very unique case study, because you very soon had a situation where there were more Black people within the church than there were of the original host community, which didn't mirror the wider society. And that, for most communities and other historians have noted, that was quite a unique situation. But as racial tensions grew throughout the 1960s and 1970s, you also see that progressing within the church.
Thank you. And Pastor Sam, how was your experience, not only as a church member, pastor, but also a president, in terms of the, I guess, maybe not tension, but the racial, any potential racial issues within the church?
Sure. I think that by the time I became president, which was 2007, Anthea mentioned about the very quick time in which the Black members had outnumbered the whites. So fast forward 30 odd years, and you had a situation where the church was now a majority Black situation. So at the lower levels, you had a situation where in the 70s and 80s, or through the 70s, there was the strong struggle of the membership, the Black membership, to get greater representation in the hierarchy of the church. That was achieved. I mean, the members were militant in achieving that. So by the time I became president, I was one of those who was inheriting the legacy of that particular struggle. So the dynamics were now changed, in that the host community were the lesser within the church. Okay, so where you had the members of the church gaining Black representation through agitation, through the Pearson package. So by the end of the 70s into the 80s, you now have Black leadership at the South England Conference in the form of Dr. Reed. 1981 was when I went to study at Newbold, and became president in 2007. So you would have had by that time quite a number of years of Black leadership. So the struggle has now taken on another form, in that you have Black leadership, but the Pearson package, which Anthea didn't mention, but the General Conference came down because the laity decided that they would withhold their tithe until there was sufficient Black representation in terms of pastoral leadership. So the mantle of the struggle then passed to the ministers who came on, and the Pearson package made provision for there to be representation at all the tiers of governance. So South England Conference, BUC, and also at TED. And so when you read the historical accounts, you find that the engine or the organ that was supposed to be overseeing the transition was actually the TED. So Walter Scragg, back in the day, president of the Northern European Division, was there with the president, and he was the mantle, because remember, TED, or North European Division, is an instrument of the General Conference. So they're then supposed to ensure that at all levels of the church, there is this representation filtering through. And I think that what happened was that where you've got now black pastors at South England Conference, black pastors moving up to BUC, it took some time to find out that the BUC, the TED had actually bought out. So they were not willing to accommodate black pastors at that level, the TED level. So it became clear that there was a glass ceiling that was operating at the BUC, and I guess it took us a while to find that out, because it would have to be about 10 years at least to really realize what's going on. But I think that we saw at New Bold College, because remember that the Trans-European Division president is also the chairman of the board at New Bold College. So we have a policy from TED of tolerating blacks, but not really allowing integration at that level.
It's so interesting you say that, because we often think about glass ceilings, now concrete ceilings as they're referred to, within like wider society workplaces. You don't think about it in terms of pastoring and the I guess moving through or climbing up into various offices. A question came in, and I guess this is directed towards Anthea, but I'm sure Pastor, you can speak on it as well. Did your research cover the conflict around black and white conference presidencies and pastoring?
Well, I think Dad talked about it more from from the latter stages. If you want to go back, I think that was one of the big issues. If you're looking at the 1970s, when there's more agitation, the South England Conference was now 80% black, mostly Caribbean, due to the influx from the Caribbean. And they were asking for greater representation amongst their pastors, because although they because I had to do interviews with people who were there at the time, and they said, well, we would go to conference sessions, and although most of the members, or a lot of the members, were black, the pastoral teams were white. The president's white, everybody else was white. And they were saying, especially when you have so many problems in society, they wanted to have more people who, looked like them and could represent their issues. And what actually happened is that the SEC then put down a subcommittee in 1975 to look into this issue because of the agitation, and say, well, should we have greater representation? Because they're asking not only just for pastors, but within the conference hierarchy, to have pastors who, reflected them. And the subcommittee went away. There were 3 black members and I think 8 white members of the committee. They went away and looked at this issue and came back and said, no, actually, the conference is not ready to have further integration at this particular point in time, which directly fed into the idea of regionalism. And interesting, one of the BUC presidents, he said, that actually black people see it as a status symbol to have a white pastor, which, I'm not saying.
Sorry, Troy and I are just baffled.
That was one of the statements. That was one of the. Wait for the book. That was one of the statements that actually was said, and so there was this blocking of the idea of, and you would get there were a few black pastors, and also if you're talking about pastoring, education became an issue because at Newbold you had a quota system. So in any given year you could only have 4 black students at Newbold, and that was the policy coming down from what my dad referred to. He called it the Northern European
Division.
Division, which is now called the TED. So they from the TED it had been told at Newbold we only have 4 black pastoral students at any one time because they were scared of becoming like the SEC, where you get, swamped. You have words like swamped, flooded, with black.
Those words that you use, just swamped and flooded, as in, were they quotes which
yeah,
you?
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
I'm doing my best to just like listen and not jump in too much, but it's interesting in light of the first part of this conversation with Judy in Gifford, and how he spoke about the ideology of whiteness, how that was perpetuated with, well, I guess like the ideas of supremacy, and not necessarily people walking around with like swastikas in the sense of white supremacists, but the ideology and the dehumanization of black people, that those words are the words which are chosen, because flooded or sorry, what was the
swarmed.
The connotation in my head are like with insects and animals and things which you don't want there when you use those words. So it's
absolutely. And I was around, I can't, I'm not sure. I'm sure you're quite young, Troy, but I was around Abby's age. Sorry?
29.
Oh gosh. Wow, you're older than I thought.
Oh gosh.
That's not a bad thing. So I was around Abby's age. Let's say I was around Abby's age when
I'm watching right now. So
okay. And Mum, don't come for me, please. And one of the, it does shake your faith. But what I do want to interject into the conversation is, if you had a project that you'd worked on, or if you had built something up, and then a group of other people came into that, and all of a sudden they're engaged in something, you didn't have an intention for them to be there. I do think there are some racial overtones, but I think some of it is just simply human nature. And as I said to you, some of the things that I've noticed, and then we'll go back to Pastor Davis. Some of the things that I've noticed is that it's not just white people who have done this within the church. I think if you look forward, that now the black people have become the ones who have built the churches, who have been here for a while, who are established, and we're seeing other groups coming in. So it's very easy to go, oh, I can't believe they said that, how absolutely racist they're seeing us as animals. But it's hard to go into somebody else's shoes and see what it would have felt like to be in this very unusual and unique situation. And that's not to excuse anyone's behavior, but I'm just trying to help us unpackage it from a human perspective.
Sure. I think that's a very excellent point, and one of the things that we ought to be aware of. I mean, Gifford talked about the theology of colonization, and so when you get black people moving in, they worship differently in terms of their music, in terms of their preaching styles, and so on. So you get this conflict, which is a cultural disconnect. Sometimes, the loud preaching, and our English brothers and sisters, they want to something that's appealing more to the cerebral than to the emotion. And so we've got to recognize that there was some of this disconnect. I saw, as I was growing up, some of the social conflicts. For example, you would have black members. We would arrive at a conference session, and we would tell the hoteliers, please remove all tea and coffee from the tables because we don't drink tea and coffee. and then our white members would arrive in the night and say, what's happened to the tea and coffee, mate? You know, so you got and then your black members would be aghast that they should even dare to think of asking for tea and coffee while we were tucking into our steak and kidney or whatever it is, or curry goat, or So there were these tensions that aren't racial but are cultural. And still exist today. And so, I think that when you put any two groups together, you are going to get these cultural disconnects.
Yeah, and I think with those disconnects, I think that dialogue is one of the best forms to address them. So, Pastor Davis, I'm wondering, during your time as president, did you ever feel the need, or was there ever the opportunity amongst the pastors to address some of these issues?
Yes, I mean, I remember going in 1995 to the General Conference session in Holland. And I'm like this. If you invite me to your wedding, I'll happily come along to your wedding. And then when I look at the album, I'll look for you and your wife, the bridal party, and then I'm going to look and say, where am I? Where do I feature in this wedding? Where's my photograph? So when we went to the 1995 General Conference session in Holland, I go to the TED stand and I'm looking for pictures of black folk. And there is just a total whiteout. We don't exist, and I found this very offensive because we were now the BUC was now the majority within the TED, yet we were not represented. There was just a total whiteout. And so I remember writing to the incoming president, Bertil Wicklander, making a complaint about the fact that there was this whiteout. When I went to the stand, the TD stand, all I saw was Northern European people, Norway and Sweden and so on. We did not exist. And I remember saying to him in my letter, when I went to the family album, I couldn't see my photo. I couldn't see any of us. What's going on? So he invited me to come up and meet with him. And he said, well, not my fault, not me, Gov. This was the outgoing president, Jan Paulsen, which he was absolutely correct.
Yeah.
This was something that Paulsen had done. But I think that we continued with that struggle for representation, because in 2000, at the General Conference session in Toronto, again, even though they may have corrected that slightly, when it came to the evangelism report, we hadn't done anything within the division, and so I felt so disenfranchised that they have at the General Conference what they call the Parade of Nations. And so you get all these various nations standing up with their flags and so on. So I just jumped up with the inter-American division for Jamaica, because the TD was telling me, you don't belong.
Yeah.
They said you don't belong because of the way we were treated. So I feel that you had a movement started by the lay members in the 70s. The baton was then passed to the ministers to continue with that for fairer representation. And let me just say this: I think that God has put into every one of us this desire for fairness, this desire for rightness, this desire for justice. So I remember when I was growing up getting beaten, and I wasn't the one who did it. You know what I mean? My parents beat me for somebody else. And there's that sense of injustice, and so we want to see right done. And when seeing what was happening within the division, knowing it wasn't right, and knowing clearly that there was this quota, because we began to see leaders from, let's say, you were, the division was now, they had a quota of one black, and as long as there was one black at the division, he could not be joined by another black pastor. You had people like Pastor Perry, Pastor McFarlane, who were good leaders in their own right, presiding over a large majority of people, and were passed over by others in lower entities with lesser people taken to the division, which was unfair.
Wow. This has been really enlightening, and I think this is all building up this whole narrative of the systems at play. But we're definitely going to have to come back and have another conversation with you guys so we can dig more into this. Anthea, we're looking forward to the release of your book with the stories, and there is so much more.
Yeah, I just want to close out by
our time's up.
There's
no time.
Anthea, legion.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to
end of the sermon, we're about to wrap
recognizing the apology that has been given recently by Dr. Beldam and by Rafat Kamal, and we want to see how that will play out in the future, recognizing the wrongs that have been done in the past, and what does those apologies really mean going forward.
Brilliant. It's a perfect transition. Guys, we really thank you for your time, and we're looking forward to dialoguing more at another time.